Could you open the door, please? Just like to speak with you. I'm from the police. Morning, hello.
No, you can't come now. I'm just coming now. Where you want to come in for?
I'll explain because it's a bit sensitive, so we'd like to come in and speak to you properly, please. Mr. Headley?
Yeah.
Ryland Headley, lovely. Thank you very much. This is my colleague Joe. We've just got a camera recording us, and I'm here today because I'm arresting you. Rape and murder of Louisa Dunn, which happened in Bristol in June 1967.
This is Ryland Headley. A 92-year-old is convicted of raping and murdering Louisa Dunn in her Bristol home in 1967. Ryland Headley, who was 34 when he raped and strangled Louisa Dunn, was told he will die in prison.
For nearly 6 decades, the murder of 75-year-old widow Louisa Dunn haunted the community of Easton in Bristol like a ghost that refused to fade, a wound that never healed, a mystery that defied closure, even as generations passed and detectives retired. Yet when police finally knocked on the door of a 92-year-old man named Ryland Headley in Ipswich in November 2024, they uncovered one of the most extraordinary cold case breakthroughs in British history.
My mother told me that Louisa's house in Britannia Road was a place of social and political activity. My grandfather, Edwin Farquhar, was a member of the early Labour Party and he loved my grandmother dearly. The death of my grandmother, Louisa Dunn, has had a far-reaching impact throughout my family. I was just 20 years old when my grandmother died, and I am now almost the same age as she was when...
A story that reminds us that justice, though it may sleep, never dies. To understand the sheer weight of this case, you must return to that summer day in 1967, when neighbors noticed something was terribly wrong at the modest home on Britannia Road, where Louisa lived alone. Her frail 5'3" frame and less than 7-stone body, giving little defense against what would prove to be a horrifying assault. For Louisa was the kind of woman everyone in the neighborhood knew. Twice widowed, gentle, often spotted at her front door, chatting with acquaintances, or simply watching the world drift by. Until one June morning, when the newspaper left for her on her garden wall remained uncollected, and the alarm was raised, leading to the discovery of her body in the front room, lying on her back with her clothing in disarray and underwear pulled down. Strangulation marks bruising her neck where her own scarf had been used as a weapon, and evidence suggesting something heavy had been forced across her mouth, silencing her final breaths forever. For detectives arriving at the scene, it was a crime of shocking brutality against an elderly, defenseless woman. And though forensic science in 1967 was in its infancy, they did gather critical pieces of evidence, including a swab that tested positive for semen and, most importantly, a fragment of a palm print beneath the little finger left on the frame of an upstairs sash window, a clue that would become both the central focus of the investigation and its greatest frustration, because in the months and years that followed, police carried out what was at the time one of the largest manhunts in British policing history, taking palm prints from more than 19,000 men, conducting 8,000 house-to-house inquiries, recording 2,000 witness statements, and screening every male between the ages of 15 and 60, living within a 1.5-mile radius of Louisa's home, along with known burglars, sex offenders, and even homeless men and soldiers absent without leave. Yet the killer slipped through the net, not because of any cleverness on his part, but simply because of geography. Headley, then in his 30s with no criminal record, happened to live just outside the police dragnet on Picton Street in Montpelier, barely 1.6 miles from the murder scene, meaning he was not compelled to give a palm print, and thus his identity remained hidden as the investigation grew cold and Louisa's family endured decade after decade without answers, watching as her case became one of Britain's most enduring unsolved murders. What makes the story all the more disturbing is that Louisa's killing was not an isolated explosion of violence, but part of a broader pattern of predation by Headley, a man whose outwardly ordinary existence masked a compulsion for targeting elderly women. And by the late 1970s, A new wave of crimes revealed the monster who had escaped detection in Bristol. In Ipswich, more than 200 miles away from the scene of Louisa's murder, Headley launched a series of nighttime attacks against elderly women, raping 2 victims aged 84 and 79, and terrifying them in their own homes. One describing the horror of being woken by the sight of a man crawling across her bedroom floor before he threatened to kill her. And in the subsequent investigation, police fingerprinted 5,000 men.
Why did you go through the upstairs window?
No comment.
Is it because you wanted to go into the bedroom?
No comment.
You look a bit confused by that. Do you want to ask me something?
He said, no, and you walked and climbed up 2 windows at this and that. No comment.
Finally capturing Headley, who admitted to the rapes and asked for 10 burglaries to be taken into account at sentencing. His modus operandi consistent throughout, breaking into the homes of older or middle-aged women who lived alone, exploiting his local knowledge of neighborhoods to find vulnerable victims, and then overpowering them with cruelty that belied his outwardly quiet life. Yet even with this conviction, no one made the connection to the unsolved 1967 case. For in that era, there was no centralized, computerized national database to cross-reference records, and so Louisa's killer continued to evade responsibility for her death, while her family endured the bitter truth that her case was growing colder with each passing year, her belongings boxed up, her story fading from public consciousness, even as her relatives carried the private grief of knowing her last moments were filled with terror. What preserved the possibility of justice, however, was the meticulous work of police at the time, who stored away every piece of evidence, from clothing to crime scene photographs to pubic hair samples, into boxes that would gather dust in archives but remain intact, waiting for a day when science would be ready to speak for the voiceless. And that day came in 2023, when Joanne Smith, a major and statutory crime review officer with Avon and Somerset Police, decided to reopen the file, sifting through decades-old material in hopes that modern forensic techniques might reveal what the human eye and the primitive science of 1967 could not. And in that process, forensic scientist Andrew Perry of Cellmark Forensic Services took a critical step, cutting a square from the back of Louisa's skirt, reasoning that given the position her body was found, any semen left behind would likely be on that section of fabric. And when he tested it, the results brought what Smith later described as a goosebump moment, a full DNA profile preserved against all odds across 57 years that matched with extraordinary certainty to none other than Ryland Headley, whose genetic material had been recorded during a 2012 police inquiry into an alleged assault where he was never charged. With this match, the threads of history finally began to weave together, and for investigators, the realization that the skirt had hidden the secret of the killer's identity for almost 6 decades was staggering, a testament to both the durability of forensic evidence and the determination of detectives who refused to let the case be forgotten. Yet even with the DNA, the challenge was monumental, because in order to bring a 92-year-old man to trial for crimes committed in his 30s, the review team had to build an unshakable case that established not just the biological evidence, but also his presence in Bristol at the time, corroborating his connection to the community, reconstructing the life he led in Montpellier during the 1960s, and showing the Crown Prosecution Service that the case was viable. This meant combing through thousands of pages of statements.
Talked to anyone about this until now.
Police notes, council records, and decades-old documentation to reconstruct the past with precision, all while aware that time was running short. not only because of Headley's advanced age, but also because the families of victims deserved justice before it was too late. When officers finally arrested Headley at his home in Ipswich in November 2024, decades of evasion came to an end, and for the first time, they were able to collect a palm print from the man who had avoided giving one in 2012 by claiming arthritis made it impossible. The irony was bitter, for he had surely known since 1967 that the palm print found at Louisa's home could condemn him, and his reluctance across the years to provide one now appeared less like coincidence and more like guilty knowledge. The instinct of a predator who feared the one clue that might one day expose him. But in custody, Headley displayed little emotion, his frail frame and white hair a stark contrast to the terror he had once inflicted on women like Louisa, a contradiction that Joanne Smith articulated when she said he appeared a vulnerable, weak old man, but that we must never forget the man he was in his 30s and 40s, the man who crawled across bedroom floors in the night, who strangled a 75-year-old widow in her own home, and who forced survivors to live with memories of unspeakable fear. When the trial of Ryland Headley finally opened at Bristol Crown Court in 2025, the weight of nearly 6 decades of unanswered questions filled the air. The faces of Louisa Dunn's descendants and neighbors, a living reminder of how crime ripples through generations, and the jurors, most of whom had not even been born when Louisa was killed, were confronted with the task of judging an act of brutality committed in a different era, but no less devastating in its cruelty, an act that had robbed a vulnerable widow of her life and stolen peace from his community. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with methodical precision, beginning with the story of 1967, the morning when Louisa's absence from her daily routine signaled that something was horribly wrong, moving to the palm print on the sash window that haunted detectives for years, and then, like a magician revealing the final piece of a long puzzle, presenting the DNA match pulled from her skirt, a billion times more likely to have originated from Headley than from any other man. And in that moment, the science of the modern world bridged the distance of decades, giving Louisa the voice she had been denied, a forensic echo of her last struggle. But the prosecution did not stop at DNA. They contextualized Headley's history, his rapes of elderly women in Ipswich during the 1970s, his pattern of stalking, entering homes, and inflicting terror, painting the portrait of a man who had honed his predatory instincts long before and long after Louisa's death. And though the defense attempted to muddy the waters, suggesting gaps in memory, inconsistencies in archival material, and the unfairness of trying a man in his 90s for acts committed in youth, the jury remained unmoved, for the evidence was overwhelming and the question of morality unambiguous. Old age does not erase guilt. Frailty does not absolve the weight of murder, and the courtroom heard that message again and again as witnesses recalled how meticulously the evidence had been preserved, how investigators had never given up, and how Louisa's family had endured an eternity of silence, only to finally hear her story told with the clarity and dignity it always deserved. When the guilty verdict was read, it was more than a legal declaration. It was history being corrected, a line finally drawn under a case that had seemed destined to remain unsolved. And yet, even in victory, there was sorrow. For Louisa had no chance to see justice done, and her loved ones had lived their entire adult lives without knowing the name of her killer, only to learn it when he was a weak old man, shuffling into court with white hair and the blank expression of someone who claimed to feel nothing. Observers of the trial noted that Headley betrayed little reaction throughout, his demeanor that, of someone detached from the proceedings, though perhaps that was his nature all along. Cold, calculating, and detached when he preyed on the vulnerable, and now equally detached as the consequences finally arrived. But the silence was not mirrored by the victims' families, who spoke through statements of grief, anger, and relief, one describing the trial as both agonizing and healing, another remarking that justice delayed was still justice delivered, even if it could not erase the decades of pain. The judge, summing up, remarked that this case stood as proof that no matter how much time passes, the truth can and will come to light, and emphasized that the sheer longevity of the investigation set a record for the oldest cold case conviction in the UK, a testament both to forensic persistence and to the enduring demand for accountability. For investigators like Joanne Smith, who had painstakingly pieced together the evidence and described the goosebump moment of finding the DNA link, the verdict was vindication, the transformation of what had once been a dusty old box in our archive store into the fulcrum of justice. And yet, even she admitted that they remained no closer to understanding Headley's psychology, the question of why he had targeted women like Louisa unanswered, whether it was opportunity, misogynistic hatred, or a deeper pathology that led him to inflict terror and violence on those least able to resist. But perhaps that absence of clarity is itself part of the horror. Headley lived decades as a seemingly ordinary man, blending into society, carrying his secrets as if they were invisible baggage. And the lesson for the rest of us is that evil can disguise itself in ordinary faces and quiet lives, sometimes for a lifetime. Outside the courtroom, the case was discussed in broader terms. What does it mean for a society when justice arrives nearly 60 years late, when the arc of accountability bends so slowly? On one hand, it demonstrates the incredible resilience of forensic science and investigative willpower, a reassurance that offenders cannot truly escape, no matter how long they evade the spotlight. On the other hand, it raises painful reflections about the women who might have been spared if Headley had been caught in 1967, because his later rapes in Ipswich, his burglaries, and his terrorizing of elderly women all unfolded because the system of the time simply lacked the tools to connect the dots. And this, perhaps, is the most tragic dimension of the case. Louisa's murder was not the end of his violence, but the beginning of years of predation that might have been stopped had he lived just within that 1.5-mile radius that police imposed. This cruel twist of fate, this failure of arbitrary geography, underlines the limitations of even the most ambitious manhunts in the pre-digital era, when police work relied on legwork, community canvassing, and handwritten records rather than computerized databases and DNA sequencing. And it is in this contrast between past and present that the true magnitude of the breakthrough becomes clear. For what was once impossible became possible not through luck, but through persistence, a refusal to let time be the final word. As Headley awaits sentencing, facing the reality that the remainder of his life will be spent behind bars, the symbolism of the case overshadows the practicalities, because at 92, his punishment may be short, but the principle established is eternal. No one who commits such crimes can ever assume they are safe, and no family who waits for justice should assume it will never come. The story of Louisa Dunn's murder, then, is not only the tale of a predator unmasked, but also a parable about patience, science, and the indomitable will of those who seek truth. And as the final gavel fell in Bristol Crown Court, the lesson reverberated far beyond the walls of that chamber, echoing into every dusty archive, every unsolved case, every grieving family still waiting. That sometimes, even after half a century, justice will find its way home.